I'm a lawyer, I'm a journalist, and I'm an activist and advocate for reproductive justice. In each of those roles, I see myself as someone constantly engaged in the act of resistance. Resistance against stereotypes, particularly negative stereotypes about Black women, about our sexuality, our fitness for motherhood, our fitness to make decisions about our own bodies. Resistance against the rigidity of thought that tries to trick us into believing the lie of white supremacy that we are less than and that we are other. Resistance against false narratives about who I am and my place in this world. It's these stereotypes and false narratives, these negative views of Black motherhood, that led a young Black girl to believe that she was a crack baby. This is a true story, and you can laugh because it's also a funny story, but it's a profoundly sad story ultimately as well. I was adopted when I was 3 months old by a white Jewish woman and a Black Catholic father. I always knew that I was adopted. This was something that they never hid from me. But I didn't have a lot of information about who my birth parents were. I didn't know where I came from. And so when I was a little girl, I convinced myself that I was a crack baby. That was just the only reasonable solution to where did I come from. It was the late 80s, and the media was going bananas over crack babies, which the media called, and this is a quote, a permanent bio-underclass, a generation of physically damaged cocaine babies whose biological inferiority is stamped at birth. 1989 was the year I started high school. I know I look young. Black don't crack. It was a hard year for me. I was starting to figure out who I was, and I just landed on crack baby. It was all over the news, so I figured it had to apply to me. And here are some actual headlines from back then. Disaster in the making. Crack babies start to grow up. I was definitely a disaster, so I had to be a crack baby, right? Here's another headline. Crack babies born to life of suffering. I was suffering. I was an angsty teenager, so clearly I had to be a crack baby. I actually read these headlines and thought that they were talking about me. That's how saturated the media was about talk of crack babies. And there were so few positive images of Black motherhood in the media on TV aside from power lawyer and mom extraordinaire Claire Huxtable. And I figured if I had been born to a Claire Huxtable type, there was no way that I would have been given up for adoption. Well, it turns out I was born to a Claire Huxtable type who was too young and who got pregnant in high school and didn't want to have a baby. And this is the kind of woman that anti-choicers and quote-unquote pro-lifers like to laud as heroes, the young Black girl who gets pregnant and realizes that she can't afford it. She doesn't want to go on welfare or public assistance, so she gives the baby up to a nice white lady. Well, 20 years later, I was diagnosed with a pituitary tumor. It's benign, don't worry, I'm not dying. And I asked my mom to find out some information about my bio parents so I could figure out what my medical history was. It turns out that my bio mom was upper middle class, grew up in Northern California. I was actually born in Mountain View. And she got knocked up by her boyfriend in high school and decided she was too young. She didn't want to have a baby. She wanted to go to law school like her dad. Weird, right? Mom, a lawyer. I could have been practicing with her at some point over the decade of my career. So my bio mom is probably a power lawyer, and maybe she's a power mom, just like Claire Huxtable. And it's sad. I mean, it's a funny story because it's ridiculous, right? But it's also sad that a privileged young Black kid who, by all standards, had everything going for me, would internalize the racism underlying this crack baby craze to such an extent that I would assume naturally that I was a crack baby and not something else. That I would assume that I had come from the stereotypical Black mother who's breeding and tossing unwanted babies up to the wayside, leaving them to be cared for by the upstanding taxpayers, the upstanding white taxpayers of America. Because as we all know, Black people, people of color, we don't pay taxes. We're the 47%, we're moochers. But these are the stereotypes that pervade. These are the stereotypes that keep me up at night scheming and researching and writing and trying to figure out a way to resist them and to combat them and trying to figure out a way to reach other Black women, other people who may not understand where they come from, who may not understand the power that they have in themselves. These false narratives and stereotypes demonize Black women, and they demonize Black mothers, and they are fomented by anti-choicers who claim, in a transparent attempt to use Black women as an ideological weapon in their war against abortion, They like to claim that abortion is black genocide. They like to claim that the most dangerous place for a black child is in the womb, as if black women are engaged in some sort of ongoing self-genocide. Now, if they want to have a nuanced conversation, and we all know that anti-choicers are not capable of nuanced conversation, but let's pretend that they were. If they wanted to have a nuanced conversation about black genocide, they would have to talk about the ravages of slavery. They would have to talk about the lengths that enslaved women traveled to wrestle control of their own reproductive autonomy, whether it was herbal remedies passed down from generation to generation, natural abortifacients that they would pass to one another, that enslaved women would pass to one another, hiding them from the white man because the white man viewed them as broodmares. The white man brought us here to birth this country. And I mean that literally. Black women birthed this country. We took care of white babies. We nursed and fed and raised them. We birthed the global economy. We certainly birthed the American economy. And so when faced with desperate circumstances, black women committed infanticide because it was preferable to consigning their children to a life of slavery. Sometimes killing your own child was the black mother's final act of love. And so these false narratives and stereotypes really irritate me because they try to cast black women as victims of big abortion, victims of contraception, victims of Planned Parenthood. When in reality, black women have always controlled our reproductive autonomy. We have always enthusiastically participated in means that would enable us to determine when and where and whether we are going to have children. And one of the things that anti-choicers love to spout, and this is something that I became very interested in a couple of years ago, was the fact that Margaret Sanger was this horrible racist who basically founded Planned Parenthood in order to eradicate black people from this earth. That's absurd. Whether or not Margaret Sanger was a racist is frankly irrelevant to me, and I like to take the Jay Smooth tack of it, which is people may or may not be racist, but my concern is whether or not you're saying racist shit and what it is that I can do to make you stop saying racist shit, right? And so Margaret Sanger certainly held racist viewpoints about black women, particularly the ways in which black women in the South used birth control. But what I found out when I did my research on Margaret Sanger was that she was rather forward-thinking for a white feminist at her time. I mean, we all have issues with white feminists, and Margaret Sanger is probably one of the, patient zeros of white feminism. But when I started to research her, there were some things that I was surprised at. For example, in 1945, she gave an interview to the Chicago Defender. And in that interview, she said, and this is a quote, "Discrimination is a worldwide thing. It has to be opposed everywhere. This is why I feel the Negro's plight here is linked with that of the oppressed around the globe." She also said, "The big answer, as I see it, is the education of the white man. The white man is the problem." Am I right? It is the same as with the Nazis. We must change the white attitudes. That is where it lies. So these claims that Margaret Sanger was some virulent racist are just ridiculous. What she was a product of her time, and what she was more than anything was really, really ableist. In her eugenics, she believed that quote-unquote morons and imbeciles shouldn't breed. But even if she were racist, even if Planned Parenthood has its roots in anti-blackness, so the fuck what? Do you know where we are? We live in a country that was founded in anti-blackness. So for people to say to me, "How dare you support Planned Parenthood?" they might as well say to me, "How dare you support this country?" And of course, anytime a black woman stands up and says anything negative about this country, Michelle Obama, for example, it's, "Go back to Africa. You're so unpatriotic. What are you doing here?" And so my concern is reproductive justice, not just reproductive rights, because reproductive justice attacks stereotypes about black women where they live. Reproductive justice unburdens black women from these pernicious stereotypes. It recognizes that black women's lives are a sum of their experiences. It recognizes that a host of economic, social, and environmental justice issues converge to shape our reality. Issues like affordable health care, contraception, funding for food assistance and welfare, funding for housing, funding for childcare, public funding for abortion, which is something that's going to happen in the next 4 years. Yeah, we should clap for that. Opposing stand your ground laws, supporting Black Lives Matter, opposing state-sanctioned violence against Black people. Because make no mistake, Black Lives Matter is a reproductive justice issue. If Black women cannot have children in this country without worrying about the fact that they are going to be gunned down in the street, then this country is nothing but a hostile birthing environment for Black women. And it's also necessary that we focus on strengthening our environmental laws so that people in Flint, Michigan aren't drinking dirty water for months and months and months on end. So reproductive justice recognizes that the reproductive rights framework, which is a framework that was created primarily by white women for white women and wealthy white women at that, reproductive justice recognizes that there's more to the right to an abortion. Reproductive recognizes that there needs to be access to abortion. There also needs to be access to programs that help women raise the children that they already have. Only reproductive justice speaks to the lives of Black women. But there are days when I feel like there's nothing that I can say, there's nothing that I can do. I've read, I've researched, I've written, I've yelled on Twitter, which I want to do, and I'm just tired. I can't even imagine getting out of bed. I can't imagine facing the world. So I tell myself that in a world that wants you dead, or in a world that at a minimum doesn't give a shit whether you are alive or dead, existing is resisting. Just being alive as a Black woman in this country is a revolutionary act. So in terms of questions, the questions that we need to ask is, how do we make this country a less hostile birthing environment for Black women? How do we lift Black women up and divest ourselves of these stereotypes, these centuries-old stereotypes that tell us that we are not worth anything? Because we know that we are worth something. Everyone here is worth something. Black women are worth something, and that's something that I strive to do. Thank you.